Alright, so guys, yep, another video in the stairwell because I really nowhere else to go. So today I'm gonna talk about the second part of the Cold War, which is the space race. Alright, the Cold War wasn't necessarily funding nations that align with their interests, more competing with each other. So in the 60s and 70s, the Soviets launched Sputnik, which was a little satellite thing, right? It would just like a little basketball size with sticks and ropes sticking out of it, and it was launched in space. All right, it was the first man-made thing that was launched into space, or as they call them, the first hunk of junk in space, because it is now deactivated. All right, so Sputnik was the most first successful, space attempt in humanity. Nothing from humans were actually in space prior to Sputnik. So the U.S. had mixed opinions, right? Some were like, okay, that's kind of impressive. Some people were like, okay, it's not good. And the military themselves was actually like, okay, this is kind of bad because they could launch missiles at us. You know that, right? Because it's in space and we can't do much about it. So the United States tries to do its own product, launching a probe, and what's called Flopnik. The reason why it's called Flopnik is because the project flopped. Right, the spaceship that was supposed to carry it up exploded, which is why it's called Flopnik. It couldn't even leave the ground, so it was humiliated. Right, so that led to the creation of NASA, anyways, National Aerodynamics Space Exploration. Alright, I don't know what it's actually called, sorry. So, another thing is that it wasn't humiliated once during the space race, it was humiliated twice. Alright? So, the US didn't necessarily, hurt the Soviet Union anyway. However, it did have spy planes. One of the most famous ones at the time was the U-2. Alright? U-2, not U-2, U-2. Alright? It was a spy plane that was very fast and was flying. It was like the highest flying plane in the U.S. arsenal, or U.S. Air Force, you call it that way. And they believed that, okay, you can't shoot this one down. Well, when the pilots and the U-2 was passing through Soviet territory of Russia, it was shot down, and they had a cyanide with a syringe that the pilots was to inject themselves, so that way he couldn't spill information in case anyone tried to torture them or take information out of them. But well, he didn't. And that the U.S. imagine being called by your biggest rival, and then they answer like, "Hey, we have your crashed U-2 plane and your allied pilot." So, which is the second humiliation for the U.S. because first it was Flopnik because your enemy put a thing into space and you tried to copy them and you failed. That's how it sucked. And two, your best spy plane that couldn't be shot down was shot down over your rival's territory, which is, very, very humiliating. So obviously, the U.S. started to crank on that, space investment. And a little bit of dark history here. After World War II, like Germany's defeat, many Nazi scientists, right, former Nazis, former National Socialists, they were brought to the U.S., France, Britain, but in the Soviet Union. However, France and Britain really lacked the resources to do it. They just kidnapped them and forced them to do work. Soviet Union and the U.S. had the money to recruit them, right? Instead of kidnapping them, because you had the money to actually convince them to join your side. And it was actually a German person. It was actually a German scientist that helped the U.S. develop a spaceship that would, bring the U.S. to the moon. All right. So the U.S., despite not being the first person to shoot something into space, they were the first person to actually land on the moon. All right. So the U.S. they launched a missile and then spaceship, and then they had to land on the moon. The first person to step on the moon was Mr. Neil A. Armstrong, who was one of the spacemen on board, obviously, because there wasn't just one, right? He wasn't alone, and he quoted one small step for man, one large step for mankind. Alright? Which meant that, he wasn't saying that this was a big victory for the US, also a victory for the world, because now with this technology you can spread it out and they can use it to also go to the moon. Right? He was like, okay, this is fine, not a US victory. But it's good. So obviously Soviet Union did get humiliated, but it got outplayed, alright, because the US didn't necessarily humiliate you, they just did better than you. So yeah, that was space race, which is the later part of the Cold War, and well, next video I will be talking about the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Thanks for listening to what I've had to say tonight, and goodbye. See you next time. Also subscribe to my channel.